if somebody's question went unanswered, like myself and my two co-founders would jump in there and be like, hey, like, here's how I've done this before, or hey, there's another thread over here where this conversation's happened before. This is the legwork part of getting community to work right, is you got to put the hours in. We've put thousands of hours in on just like engaging in the community. And that's why today, even though we have 1,500 members, there's still really deep conversations in a transparent way that like you don't get anywhere else in the world.
Today, I am super thrilled to have Chris Samila with us. Chris is a co-founder of Partnership Leaders, a membership community of 1,500 plus partnership professionals. He started Partnership Leaders as a free Slack community to enable peer-to-peer learning amongst partnership professionals. But then he has turned it into a strong bootstrap business. Today, Chris leads the member experience team at this company. That's why he is the perfect person to learn from in case you are building or planning to build a membership community business. Chris, welcome to the show.
Real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
This episode is sponsored by Curated Connections, a simple matchmaking tool with an easy to justify pricing that helps you increase engagement in your community. Check it out by visiting curatedconnections.io or go to the link in the show notes below.
Hi, Chris. You have a really big conference coming up, and I saw on your LinkedIn that Partnership Leaders also does citywide events called Elevation Tour.
Yeah, so we have three different types of events to some extent. There's a big conference called Catalyst, which is it's now become probably one of the largest conferences in the world for the partnership space, which is super exciting. And we have the sort of independent city level events. So think of all the large cities around the world, beyond even North America. We get our members together, networking, education. And sometimes we string these together as part of a tour, which we call the Elevation Tour. And we bring innovative technology companies with us and we go, do a string of 5 to 6 cities all at one time over like a 2-week time period.
That's amazing. And when did you start these in-person events?
Yeah, so we started the community in December 2018, and it was initially actually an email thread, which turned very quickly into a Slack conversation and Slack community. It was totally free at the time. And towards the end of 2019, we actually started doing field events in San Francisco, New York, some places where there's lots of partner professionals. And then obviously 2020 hit. We reverted right back to doubling down, tripling down on the digital side of Partnership Leaders. And the community grew enormously. Granted, it was free. And so partner people know other partner people, and they just started inviting them very, very quickly. So it became a destination for a lot of these partner professionals.
Okay, so this is cool. So you actually started doing these events before you made the community into a subscription model business.
Yeah, exactly. It was very apparent that members wanted to meet together. So we had these like member-led meetups occurring. We also had friendly technology companies that were willing to provide some space for us to bring folks together. And it was something that was like, we were going to obviously like really focus more energy on that in 2020, and then 2020 happened.
Yeah. Okay, this is interesting. Were you already thinking of, were you already building it like a business back then, or were you doing these events just to enable networking within the partnership community?
Yeah, they were totally free at the time. In fact, like our events are still open to, like, our members get preference to go to the events, of course, but like the general partner community, even outside of PL, are allowed to come to these events today. Like, let's just call it like PL or Partnership Leaders as a business was not something that far along in the journey. Like, for context, there's 3 founders. We all had day jobs, which were pretty intense. And we had high aspirations of what we could do with Partnership Leaders. And it was really on the backside of COVID when we realized, like, okay, this is a lifeline for a lot of these people, both from a business perspective, but also from a personal side of things, because that was a tough year for a lot of folks, obviously. And so that was when it really made us double down on just like, what do we want this to be as we grow? And so we spent the summer of that year going through what you would do for any kind of like startup company, which is, start figuring out how do the economics work if we transition to a paid community, what tooling do we need? A paid version of Slack would be very helpful because all of our messages were disappearing by this point. And so I think that was, and also the staffing, like, how do we at that moment in time, it was not something we could charge a lot of money for. And so it's like, how do we grow intelligently, leveraging resources internationally outside of the US to help us do that, as well as, volunteers and people that would offer their time for free because they believed in the mission that we were on.
Right. So coming back to organizing these events for a second. So how are you able to organize so many events in so many different cities around the world?
So we have a few routes to make this work at scale. One of them is we have this concept of city hosts. So we have like these city hosts in key cities that are members in the community. They are volunteers, and they get visibility for their professional brand, and they help us figure out like what venues might be good. They help, we try to find friendly tech companies that help us do these at their offices. Sometimes we do these also at restaurants and at, adult mini golf and things like that. But I think like the core of it is like leaning in with some of these city hosts, and then also backfilling with somebody who's very good at doing events. And we have a paid team of contractors that help us do these well, because that's the thing with events is like it's the small cuts that'll kill you, where it's like, oh man, the printer doesn't do sticky badges, they only do magnetic badges, or like small stuff like that where you're only on the ground in the city for a very short amount of time. And it's like knowing that that's sort of taken care of was key. And then now we've got enough sort of evidence that we can bring the community together that we can go out and get sponsors from partner technology companies, in essence, companies that want to sell to our persona. They're willing to get behind these events because they are, and there's a bit of elegance to this to make sure it doesn't disrupt the member experience. It's not supposed to be like an overt selling arena, but it's like you can get into conversations with these attendees that you understand their problems. And, if you have a lot of empathy for trying to solve those, like you're naturally going to get into sales conversations and how your technology could probably help these people. So we spend a lot of time with the sponsors to make sure they understand how to operate in this environment successfully. Because if they can find business, then they're willing to do more of these. And we have a lot of repeat sponsors now on these like city events, which by the way, we call them Peel House events, kind of like Soho House. And so so for context, if you do this well, like we just released the second half of this year's cities we intend to do things in, and we're almost sold out like instantly, because this is we look at the world of marketing right now, SDRs are less and less effective. Community can play a very powerful role in making sure that, those companies can get to market in a just a new buying world. It's not, you can't just cold call people until you beat them down. You got to figure out a new way to market.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. And can you give us a really short brief into what a partnership professional does?
Yeah, so good question. The best way to kind of think about this is like partnerships in quotations have been around for forever. Like one caveman tribe would trade things with another one and whatnot. Sort of modern channels, especially when the tech industry started taking off in the 80s, you would get to market through people that were in the distribution or resellers or other organizations that would, in essence, help you take your widget, whether it's software or hardware, and get that to market through the channel, in essence. And so we have, 30 plus years of these channel professionals that have been adding a ton of value to the economy. SaaS started changing the world of partnerships quite a bit, because you have a product that is constantly changing, and the customers, because they have the opportunity to influence the product roadmap, they like to have a direct connection in many cases to the person building the software, combined also with data and privacy and other things like that. How companies get their products to market is changing because of SaaS. And so we focus in partnership leaders on both the traditional channel world, but also really, and this is like the core of our members, is like, think of the venture-backed SaaS companies from, as well as publicly traded companies, that there are these partner professionals that are helping build relationships with other technology companies, with service providers, with strategic partners that can help you get to market really efficiently. The playbook for those people is changing very, very quickly, and how they learn is changing as well. And so it's kind of like right time, right place for us to build a home for all these professionals to get better at their craft.
Yeah, and that home is the PL community that you've created.
Exactly.
What does the membership for the PL community cost?
So we have four different tiers in partnership leaders. So there's individual contributors all the way up to CXOs, or like chief partner officers, chief channel officers, et cetera. The price range is like $600 up to $1,800 per year. We do offer monthly memberships as well, which are more expensive per month, sort of a trade-off on that. But yeah, that's in essence. And we didn't always, this is something, as we've built more value on the community and we built a network, like we've been able to charge more. So there's a fair exchange of value between us and the members. But there's still like education. There's many people that join that have never been part of a paid professional kind of community. And so helping them go through the cycles of like, how do you get your company to pay for this? Or increasingly, more than half of our members pay out of pocket. And some of this is just a realization that if you don't invest in your network and in your education, you're going to be caught flat-footed if your company has a layoff and you're caught up in that.
Right. So this pricing strategy, this is really interesting. So the pricing scales based on the member experience. Can you speak a little more about that? Like, what do more senior members get out of the PL community? How did you come upon this pricing model? I'm sure that you didn't start out with this model.
No, we did not. Part of this is through the natural like listening motion of like, what do your customers need? And then how do you create an environment? Because, when you're 100 members, you can have flat pricing and a sort of an experience that's homogenous across all the members. But as you grow, someone who's very senior in their career probably has needs and desires and capital to invest in things that is different than somebody who's earlier in their career.
What type of needs and desires?
Yeah. So like if you're a vice president of partnerships or you're a chief some kind of chief executive of some type, you're beyond the stage of needing as much guidance on, to some extent, being a partner professional, and you're starting to get in the world of like, how do I read a P&L? How do I engage with other executives to do change management? How do I engage with other members that are at the same seniority level as myself? Because there's the thing that happens is if you have VPs or chief executive whatever's meeting with younger members, that's great. That's a mentor program. Like that which is valuable in itself. But if you're someone who's quite senior, your bandwidth of time to do things and the speed at which you have to find answers to stuff, as well as the risk profile of if you make bets as an executive and they go wrong, that's potentially, career changing. And so you need to be able to meet with other people and learn things in a sort of a context that's different than somebody who's maybe younger in their career. And so we're building functionality, whether it's the peer-to-peer learning aspects or structured learning or ability to meet other members, that is sort of graduated against a tier of seniority inside the community.
This is really interesting. So you're essentially designing 4 different member experiences for all of these 4 different personas.
Yeah, and we're not. Like it's an evolution in progress kind of thing. And I think we're not the only ones doing this. There's definitely other communities we're aware of that, at least for the serving, professionals kind of like communities, that have realized this is somewhat of a logical evolution. And I'll give you one more example. Like if you're doing a Peel House event in New York, there's an event for everybody to some extent that can go to that. But then there's the need for, someone who's more senior to maybe spend time in a more intimate setting after the main event. How do you create those experiences for those people so that they are getting what they need, and, that you keep the community exciting for them?
How do you do that? Actually, like, how do you?
You're not going to get all the trade secrets. You're not going to get all the trade secrets.
Okay, but essentially, like from what I'm getting is that the more experienced members, they're paying to get a higher level of care and like connectivity or curation for them.
Yes, yeah. At the root of it, that's exactly right. And there are features that probably we can build that extends on that concept of, if you're listening to where your members are at in their career journey, what do you need to build to help them be successful? This is where, I think community to some extent is not capturing all of the things that companies like partnership leaders and other folks are doing. Because when you hear the word community, to some extent, you're sort of, narrowed down into like, oh, it's like a place where people meet each other and share information. And it's like, well, yes, but then on top of that, what do you build for this audience that makes them stay and expand with you over time?
Right. That is interesting. So I remember you mentioned in our call earlier that you provide members with community connections and resources. Like that is the heart of what like three things that you provide. And we've talked about community, which is essentially the events and the Slack community, and then the connections. I suppose like those connections are enabled in the community and through these events. And what about the third part of it?
Yeah. So on the resources side of it, there are things that you as a community leader can aggregate that members have created, resources such as guides, templates, things that would help somebody not have to recreate the wheel every time they need to go get something done. And so some of that's like making it easier to find the things that other people have shared in the community. And then there's also investments you could make as an organization to build things that you consistently hear from the community is missing. This is where you become this, and this, from a brand perspective, if you nail that consistently enough, it becomes a really strong hook for the members, because they're not just getting peer-to-peer learning and things where, they're having to lean in and do people talk about like a gym membership, which is true. Like you gotta work out to actually get the gains, but you can do stuff to, give people the right equipment to get those gains faster. And so that's how we sort of think about the resources side of it. And some of that manifests itself in, a directory of these items. We do actually industry research now that we get sponsors for that solves vexing questions. We have an audience that can share information about what they're seeing. And when you bring all that knowledge together and you interpret it, you can do this like industry research to some extent that becomes very valuable for your members, but also just the broader sort of persona that you're pursuing.
I like it. This is really interesting. Talking about the community for one more second, you mentioned that your community is hosted on a paid Slack version, which is
Definitely
insane because you're paying for essentially 1,500 members of Slack access. Why is this so important to you? Because at this scale, like Slack cost would be a major component of your own P&L at the company. So how do you justify this expense?
Yeah, I think this is something that a lot of communities, in the absence of monetizing their members, like figuring out a model around that, you're stuck in this world where the goodness of what the community is doing is lost after 90 days or however long the self-serve plan, free plan is. And so you're sort of, I think this is probably one of the most dangerous situations to be in, because if you think about the member experience, where the folks that have asked questions, gotten answers, and like the community sort of like come upon a common understanding of how to solve a certain problem, if that sequence has to reinvent itself every 90 days or however often that it happens, the most senior people that are the most experienced that should be engaging, they sort of get worn out because they see the same conversations happening over and over again. They don't feel like they're getting better, themselves. And so I think this is like, Slack's business model is a smart one in my eyes, because you build something on top of their solution, and then at some point, I think it's on the community to be able to figure out how do you get enough capital to be able to actually pay for this software. Because used correctly, we run our entire business on Slack. It's not just for the members. We don't use email, like it's, and this is somewhat of an artifact to think of like modern kind of motions around how you might scale a company. But we've synced in, Zapier workflows, and HubSpot's plugged into it. And like, we have all the notifications flowing in. And so like Slack is not just the environment where the members are getting value. It's also essential to how we actually scale our business. And so, And one note on just like Slack versus Discord versus any of the other ones, it's going to matter who your persona is, but like for sure in like the technology world, many startups are using Slack. Newer startups. If you have a lot of traditional enterprise companies, you may want to invest in the MS Teams infrastructure. Like think about who your persona is and what their tech stack looks like, and just think about the friction around how do you get them engaging in the right place without without a lot of effort.
Right. So essentially, what you're saying is being on the paid version of Slack allows your community to have a memory, and for members to be able to go back and recall from that memory whenever they feel like they need to.
Yeah, totally. As well as all the other things such as single channel guest access, which we use heavily, integrations. We have a ton
How do you use
of
the
those.
single channel guest access?
So there's a good example is for Catalyst, for example, we use a channel inside of partnership leaders. Not all of the attendees going to Catalyst, our conference, are members. And so we create a channel for our members and the regular attendees to get updates about the conference, to share information, to meet each other. And so that's like one example of like, it's just super valuable for us to aggregate these people in one place while also not encumbering the cost of making them full Slack users in essence.
Right. And just like one more follow-up question here, because I find this really interesting. How did you understand that your members were using Slack in a way where having this memory was valuable to them? Like, do you have any like data or any member experience, like interviews, to justify that yes, members are going in and searching for the most common questions that have been answered more than 3 months ago, and that is actually valuable to them?
I mean, to some extent, this is the value of the founders also doing the job. Like all of us were in partnerships. And so when we ourselves started looking for answers, and I was like, I know we talked about this previously. and it's like, it's hidden behind the history wall. That was like all the evidence we needed that like, okay, this is going to, this will impact the experience people have, especially as we add more and more folks to the community over time. So it was a pretty black and white scenario for us that like, we need to figure out how we can get enough capital to be able to invest in Slack, invest in our CRM, invest in staffing, help us actually, because again, we all had day jobs. This was not our full-time job. How do you scale this thing up so that like you can asynchronously run this other organization in a way that's like not overly taxing on your mental horsepower each day? So it's like we see a lot of other community founders that are in a similar boat where they're in this transition phase where they have a day job, but they also have a passion for building something around community.
No, this is amazing. This is actually a really great segue towards the next segment of the interview, where we'll be discussing about your journey of building and the early days of PL. So to get started, you mentioned earlier that partnership leaders started as an email thread, which then turned into a free Slack community. What was this transition like, and why did it like start as an email thread?
Yeah, it started an email thread because I had just transitioned from being more of an independent contributor. Like I was on my own career journey, moving up in the world, and I had just joined a company in Atlanta. And so I was like, okay, I'm in a much more senior role than I was previously. There are things I know how to do and there's things I don't know how to do. And I was like, I know that some of my peers had probably tackled some of these things. And I was like, well, we should probably help each other. So we got this email thread going. There's about 17 of us on there, if I recall correctly. And I purposely, and this is like one of the culture setting things that I think is important, I purposely included my direct competitor who I had known from a previous company in that email thread. Because like him and I were like, you know what, like we're in partnerships for a career. We may not always be competitors, and we're not going to share stuff that would hurt our own companies, but like the concept of like creating that environment that's a safe space for your members, like we made that very apparent that the two competing companies were helping each other. And it's sort of that then helped other people who are in a similar situation feel comfortable to be able to share, again, in a way that doesn't cause problems, but is like acknowledging the fact that you're potentially going to be here for many, many years. And we all change companies relatively often. So yeah, we moved over to Slack because it was just like, okay, email's too slow. And it was like, also we're getting lost, you're like, okay, you're responding 5 days after he already gave an answer to that. And it was like, okay, this is definitely not smart. We should move over to Slack. And that was the beginning of okay, who else is interested in this? And we kind of just built from there.
Right. I love how you're setting culture from the day one, and before you even probably had the idea of turning this into partnership leaders and the thing that it is today. And also that it started with an email as an email thread with some of the people that you know personally, and this is a way for you to share information amongst each other. So one question that I have is, so when you decided to make this into a Slack community, a free community at this point, and you started inviting more people, because I'm assuming that since you had all of this conversation and relationships with these people already, the community must have been buzzing in the early days, right?
Yeah, I mean, we very quickly got to people I've never met before because it was like, Slack's easy to invite people, which makes sense. They want to increase user base. And so there was like people jumping in pretty quickly, like, hey, I'm so-and-so from this business. And, a lot of energy around that. And it's important to obviously capitalize on that. And then as quickly as possible, figure out like, okay, what are the channels that we need? Don't create too many of them. Like channel creep is a problem. You have lots of quiet channels. That's bad. But like also just kind of setting the tone of like, what kind of questions should people be asking? How can people respond to those? If somebody's question went unanswered, like myself and my two co-founders would jump in there and be like, hey, like, here's how I've done this before, or, hey, there's another thread over here where this conversation's happened before. This is the legwork part of getting community to work right, is you got to put the hours in. We've put thousands of hours in on just like engaging in the community. And that's why today, even though we have 1,500 members, there's still really deep conversations in a transparent way that like you don't get anywhere else in the world. I am confident that we have, senior leaders from big tech companies going deep on like stuff they're trying to work through. And it's invaluable. You can't get that on LinkedIn. So I think like putting the legwork in early of that culture setting and that effort to make sure that the members are having a good experience is like super, super important. And having that domain expertise is also a critical piece, which is why I think like it's interesting when I see these like roll-up companies with, grabbing a bunch of communities. It's like, I hope they have someone who's like super, super passionate that's in there like every day helping the members, because you can't just create the playing field and hope that everyone's going to use it,
Right. That makes a lot of sense. It's not a community if you put a bunch of people in a Slack together. You have to do the work to make it into a community.
Yeah, because like, I mean, just a good example is like how you ask questions is somewhat a learned behavior to elicit good responses. We've trained people, like if somebody asks like a very flippant question where you're just like, hey, what's the best blah? And it's like, you're not going to get a lot of people to maybe respond to that. But if you say, hey, I've been working on this problem. Here's what I've found, here's where I'm stuck, or like, can somebody validate that my thinking is correct or not? You're going to get a lot better answer. And you'll probably get people to reach out to you via direct message to like talk with you about that. And so like training people that have not been in to some extent, a real-time communication environment. It's not like a forum where it's like, I can ask a question and then 6 days later, people are responding. It's like, there's moments in time where you can ask things and respond to people. And I think that changes the dynamic of how members should be engaging. And so like, yeah, we spend a lot of time on that, like sort of training someone how to extract value and engage in a way that's going to elicit a good experience for them and everybody else around them. And we are ruthless about anybody trying to sell in the community. Like instantaneously, we delete that message, we reach out to them and we will tell them, hey, like, can't do that. Like, here's the way, here's the kind of stuff that, you can frame that differently, or, that kind of stuff. You gotta be hyper focused on like, how do you make sure there's no like negative situations that are happening because you're like kind of just letting things run, and then we see that a lot in other communities where it's just like kind of like a free for all. And it's just like, there's too much noise. Like if you think about somebody's own Slack environment, they have dozens to hundreds of unread messages. Like you got to keep your community hyper clean so that the stuff that's there is like relevant and it's not selling crap.
That makes a lot of sense. And in order to teach people how to ask a great question, are you teaching this to new members in the onboarding phase, or are you just correcting them when they ask a bad question by DMing them?
So a few different angles. Like we use Common Room. We love it. It helps us obviously know what's going on in the community, and it helps us understand how do we, programmatically onboard people with messaging. And so some of that's during the onboarding phase with messages where it's like, hey, here's some example ways to ask questions. And a lot of it's like, as you grow, people's nervousness or hesitancy to ask questions grows alongside that, because they look around and they're like, there's a lot of people here that probably know what they're doing. And the reality is that 99% of the time, if somebody asks a question, there's probably dozens of other people that have the same question. They're just a little nervous to ask it. And so we spend a decent bit of cycles trying to encourage people, like, think about your business problems. What are you trying to solve? Like, and kind of nudge them to ask those things. And then as a community manager, if you know your members well enough and you know some of the experiences they have, you can do a little bit of matchmaking there where you're like, hey, this question about resellers is something I know this other member knows about. And you can either tag them on the thread, or you can DM them and say, hey, like, if you have time, you have some amazing experience. Can you share and help this person think about this problem in the right way? And that like back end work to make sure that there's engagement and it's relevant. That's part of the job, I think, of these community managers, is like, it's it's not an obvious thing, but it's the way that you get to ensure that the community is staying relevant for people. So, and then to answer, just to close out the question, if somebody asks a bad question, like or something that's like not going to elicit great responses, like we'll DM them and say, hey, if you kind of reframe this slightly, give more context, I bet you're going to get some more folks to reach out to you. And also, you got to make sure the person realizes that not every question is going to be a home run. Like, you might ask something where there's just nobody that knows how to do that. It's just like, it's a unique little niche thing. And it's like, sorry, like, it is what it is. So you got to make them realize that, like, hey, like, keep at it, and also, like, if you don't just think about asking questions, think about where you can carve out 15 minutes a week to share your experience, because most people are just reading Slack. They're not actually posting and replying. And so if you do create that environment for your members where there's not a mountain of messages happening every day, but there's, some messages but are really rich and deep, a lot of people are going to see those. And so this is where we kind of train people on, like, your professional brand to some extent is wrapped up in how you think about supporting other people, because other folks will see your message back to someone. And you don't know what kind of goodness that might do for you down the line, career-wise. And so we try to, like, really help people understand and connect the dots on that.
Love this. I love how tactical we're getting right now.
Yeah, it's the 5 years of like figuring this stuff out.
Yeah, super amazing. Okay, so I'm gonna get some more tactics out of you. So when you went from free community to a subscription community, did you add something to the offering to make the offer sweeter, like for members who were essentially getting the same thing for free previously, but now have to pay for it?
That's a great question. So I think we had built up a lot of goodwill by the time we got to the point where it needed to go paid, and not everybody understood. Like, some folks were like, I've been answering questions in here, I should be free. And you're like, well, that doesn't really work, because we have to pay for this stuff somehow. And so, like, we were pretty diligent about saying, like, there's no free rides. Like, everybody, has contributed here. And if we're on a mission to elevate the partnerships world, we'd love for you to be part of this and to be one of the founding members. And we went from like 1,000 members down to 100. What happened on the backside of that was, for the 100 that stayed, the engagement skyrocketed because they were like, no, I'm paying for this. Like, I'm going to make sure I get my money out of it, and so like, it actually was like probably one of the best things that ever happened to the business. And it's like the people who are here are in it, and they're going to lean in and contribute and help each other, and subsequently get a lot of value back to themselves. And so like, we didn't change like that at that moment in time. There wasn't a lot of like new stuff because we didn't have any capital to build new stuff. We got to pay for this software, and we got to pay for some staff that can help us actually scale this thing up. But very quickly, as we got the capital, we're like, we're going to run this thing like a SaaS company, and like, we're going to have OKRs, and we're going to track it. When members are applying, how often do they accept it? What's our churn rate and all that kind of stuff? As quickly as possible, getting into the data where you can understand the metrics of the business can just help keep yourself accountable. And it makes it a lot easier to then share with the community the things you're going to build, because you can do it. Like, don't overpromise if you can avoid it. As long as you're kind of methodically chipping away at the stuff that's most relevant for your members, that's the best you can do,
Yeah. No, I love this strategy. This makes a lot of sense why members who stayed and who felt that they had value would keep on and engage even further, and that would drive up the value for everyone else even higher.
Yeah, this is where that sort of, you're cashing in a lot of that equity that you've hopefully built up over the time, because you've got you can start with that free community. But at some point, like, it's like, you have to make investments to be able to make this thing work. And so I think it's just important that you get some allies. And we did a lot of, discussions with members. We're like, okay, here's where we're at. Like, if we want to do these other things, because we have high aspirations, would you support that? And like, how much would you be willing to pay? And we kind of triangulated through that market research on what we could charge, in the early days.
That makes a lot of sense. And talking about today, is there something that you do to ensure that members renew their subscriptions? Or are you able to sense when somebody's about to churn? And if you sense that, what do you do to prevent that?
Yeah, I mean, this year's been tough in the tech industry. Like, we've had a lot of layoffs. And so there's unexpected churn that happens because somebody had their membership attached to their corporate, L&D budget. And so that's why it's important to make sure you're creating enough value for people that they pay out of pocket, as a backstop. Engagement's obviously something we try to monitor as closely as we can to see, like, hey, we haven't seen this person in a long time, like they haven't logged in a long time, rut-row. They haven't gone to any of the events. You can look at all the kind of surface area as a community where someone could be engaging. But also just kind of taking into account that, like, people go through waves, like, just because somebody is not engaged for the month of May doesn't mean they're unhappy. So you've got to kind of start to backfill that with like NPS style surveys and stuff that doesn't wear people out, but at least gives you a temperature check on kind of where they're at. And so, like, that's a journey we're on right now, is kind of figuring out like how to really do that elegantly. I think in the same way that Common Room can be used for the onboarding piece, it can also be used for the renewal cycle, where it's like the combination of whether it comes from Common Room or if you can fire this off from a CRM, if you're using that to manage your community, 90 days out, 60 days out, 30 days out, what do you say to folks? And then how do you make sure that when they give you an affirmation around how they feel, whether they're going to churn or not, making sure that you get the sequencing of the following messages correct, so that, you're in a good spot and you're not annoying them, is key. But that's been like a big focus area for us this year, is like, how do we make sure that this like member experience motion is like as good as it can possibly be? And some of that's just like tooling related, getting something like Common Room, but also like staffing up and hiring people. Because there is a human component of like talking to folks, getting a sense of where they're struggling, what do they need, and then feeding that back to the business in a way that, we can build the right things, hopefully, to keep them with us.
I love this. So you're very reliant on Common Room to be your eyes and brains into what the community is experiencing, or what the members may be feeling, and getting a temperature check on your community.
Yeah, and we're a relatively recent customer with Common Room, so we've been using Slack's analytics directly as a proc. It's a poor proxy, but that was one way. You can also look obviously at, email opens. If you have a newsletter, you can look at event data to see if they're attending things. Like all those things live outside of Common Room. The benefit of Common Room is that it's just so much easier to see this stuff when you're pumping that data into a user profile so that you can kind of see where you're at.
So you're able to pump in the data about events into the same like user profile in Common Room.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something that we talk often with their product team and stuff is like, and also other Common Room users is like, there are lots of different data points that probably make sense from an engagement perspective or activity perspective that we want to get back into Common Room. So we have that central place to look at this stuff, because the traditional CRM is just not designed for managing community. It's not the right type of just data architecture, I feel like, to do that well. And so this is why things like Common Room, I think, exist, is like they, increasingly can become sort of this place where you can monitor and see how things are going, but also help your individual team members collaborate on like, okay, we have somebody that's at risk, or they've told us something that we need to make sure we're changing. Capturing that information and operationalizing it is something that like you have to do when you get to like the scale of, 1,000+ members. So yeah, that's like, it's an exciting moment because we've gotten to the point where we can have this kind of technology. Now it's like, okay, how do we use it and just maximize the crap out of it so that it's making a big impact?
I sense that you're really big into using the technology and maximizing it to automate stuff and, create the maximum leverage for you. You mentioned that you're also a heavy user of Zapier. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, we use Zapier. I forget which one it is.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, we have their partner team inside Partnership Leaders too. I should probably know this answer.
It's cool. But can you tell me, like, what are some of the most important ways that you use Zapier at Partnership Leaders?
Yeah, so some of it's like the member validation flow. So when somebody hits our website and they fill out application, that triggers it's a HubSpot form, which triggers a Zapier workflow, and that drops into a channel. And then this is one of the also components of community that we feel strongly about, is that like making sure that the members that are joining have the relevant background is really important to us. So we review every single member and we accept or deny them based on their background. And so that sort of dialogue that happens around the approval deny process, the surface area where that happens is in a Slack channel. And then the response is then sent back into a different system to fire off an email via Zapier so that the machine turns as quickly as possible. But I think think of like all the permutations of what that could look like for people registering for events and, things that we care about, that instead of going and, needing to run a report in the CRM, we can just pipe that information over into a dedicated Slack channel that we can also, I just find it's a heck of a lot easier to be like Command F, search for whatever. And it's just like, it just looks back in time in that channel and finds it. So yeah, that's when we talk about like running the business on top of Slack, like that's kind of what I'm talking about, is like, it is the place where we have discussions and have the data to like kind of understand where the business is at.
Yeah, super interesting. And for the community, I understand that the chats are in Slack, but what about the recordings and all of the learning material that you have? Where do you host those?
So we host every single roundtable webinar, even our conference collateral, all that stuff actually goes into, there's YouTube channels, private YouTube channels, but those are shared in a specific Slack channel inside of Partnership Leaders. And the benefit from that is that, again, you can use Command F and find, I want to look up tech partnerships. Well, here's every single, event that's happened that has information about that. I think over time, like we're figuring out, like, this is one of the next focus areas, is like, if somebody's not a power user of Slack and they're in there all the time, how do we take that information and surface it to them based on the preferences they have for different topics and partnerships? And how do we push that to people is something we're thinking a lot about. And it's like kind of the next focus area for us. But I think all of the, like, anything that happens, we try to bring that back into Slack, because if you always search in Slack to find something, then it's like an easy way for us to surface stuff to people that way.
That makes a lot of sense. And so for the resources, once again, you mentioned that all the recordings and everything, they're present in the YouTube channel, but those are publicly accessible. What about the resources that you want to be available exclusively to the paying members?
So all the recordings are actually not public resources. So we do those as public webinars, but the recordings are private. And that's another thing that we try to, as like a component of the member benefits, is like you get access to hundreds of highly relevant conversations about partnerships. You can only get to those via that channel, which links over to that private YouTube channel.
Okay.
The actual resources themselves lives in a Google Drive today, and it's structured based on topic area. And so you can like double click, be like, I need, career stuff. And it's like job description, partner development, associate. Great. Here's 7 different job descriptions you can lift to go try to build your own. And so it's like the Google Drive for that's pretty massive. There's hundreds of documents in there. But it was like the fastest turnaround thing we could do to get to market really quickly with the least amount of friction, because most people get how to use Google Drive. I'm sure we'll probably eventually find something else that's like custom suited for that. But the trade-off is like anything people have to log into that lives somewhere else, you're just creating a friction point for yourselves. So that's
so the way to get to this Google Drive is through your Slack, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So we've bookmarked all the resources that are relevant for people at the top of each channel. So we have like a resources channel where new things are shared. And at the top of that Slack channel, there's a hot link that goes straight over to the Google Drive so that people can get into it. And what we did is we took all of the members' emails and we added them to a Google group that was set up on the admin side of things. So that way, if somebody tries to access the Google Drive that's outside of the community, it flags for us that the email doesn't match our database so that they can't get to it in essence.
Okay. So you're actually like, you lying when you said that your whole business runs on Slack.
Not kidding.
Okay. I've never heard of this. You're like maximizing how all the things that Slack can offer for a community and using YouTube and Google Drive and all of those things within Slack, so that Slack is the place where members log into and they can access everything from there.
Yeah, you can start to understand why we think the paid version of Slack makes sense when like everything that happens has some connection back into. That's the foundation for all the ways that members get benefits.
This is very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And so to close up, I want to talk about your hiring philosophy. And can you start by telling us how many people do you have on the member experience team?
Yeah, so there's a team of 4 of us at the moment. So myself, we have a very global team. So we have somebody in Boston, we have somebody in Argentina, 1 person in the Philippines. We try to find the makeup for the member experience team to have someone, high EQ, where they can kind of, read through what somebody's saying and be able to figure out what, where they're at. But also combine that with, a data-driven mindset, and then like sort of has the mindset of like action oriented. Everybody we've hired for a member experience team, to some extent, none of them come from partnerships. They don't have domain expertise, but they have the capacity, to learn as quick, very quickly. And that's something we test during the hiring process is like, here's a real world problem we're facing for our community. Present to me, how you would solve this as part of the final process in the hiring thing. It's just, we'll give them access to the Slack community so they could see and learn as quickly as possible. And, trial by fire, can you impress me that and how you might try to solve some issue we have that shows that they're gonna move at the pace we probably need them to.
I love this. So you're running it like a venture-backed company, like with the fire and the horsepower of a venture-backed company, even though you're a bootstrap business.
Yep, that's what operate. If you do it well, like this is something we hope to do for the rest of our careers. This is the opportunity at hand for anybody who's thinking about building communities, that you do it well, you keep the members happy, like the sky's the limit, because we're just the very beginning of this transition of people orienting themselves around being part of some professional community in their industry. And sometimes there's multiple communities that exist out there, and that should just get you even more fired up to deliver the best experience so that you can do this for a living, because it's an amazing job. Like it's hard, it's challenging. There's not a lot of people we can look at for, there's no books you can buy on Amazon that tell you how to do this per se. But it's like, it's super, super inspiring when you start to get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this. This is an amazing note to close this interview on. Do you have any advice that you would give to somebody who is looking to start a subscription community business?
I'd say just make sure you understand kind of the persona you're going after is like the most important thing. Like it's easy to get over your skis and think like, oh, like I'm going to serve a whole bunch of people. But you just water down to some extent what's relevant. So I think like be pretty methodical about who you're trying to serve. Keep it the channel creep thing is probably one of the easiest ones to get. You're like, oh, there's 2 people talking about this subject. We'll go create more channels around that. And it's like, keeping the density around the engagement so that it feels really active, even when there's not a ton going on, is important. I'd say just, there's a lot of innovation happening in the partner tech space on like the technology side. And so joining things, there's CMX out there, there's Uncommon Room, which is Common Room's community for themselves. You can join Slack's community, which is they're using Slack to actually help their customers. Like going and kind of embedding yourself and talking and seeing what other people are doing is like, it's a shortcut, like instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. And so, yeah, that's the stuff at least we've been trying to do, is just learn as quickly as we can from what other great things people are doing.
This has been amazing. Thank you so much for joining me on this conversation, Chris. I loved having you here, and you shared some really, really insightful comments and experiences. So thank you so much for being so open for us.
My pleasure. Yeah, hopefully some folks will leave feeling pretty fired up about working on the community world.